Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and Happy New Year. We are going from Raiders of the Lost Ark to graphic novels. A lot has been written about the Nazis and the occult, but there was a very real obsession with Aryan mythology and cults within the Third Reich. Dr. Philip Blood is coming on to explain all. So I'll bring him in. You've had a lurgy the last few days, but hopefully you're better now, my friend. Are you on the mend, Dr. Phil?
I'm hoping. Look, fingers crossed. It's this coffee which is now the pain,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah, Mags had the same.
If I
So
have a break, just it's coffee.
I'll mute you and we'll have a coughing fit. But
Yeah.
when we proposed this show, actually it was quite a few weeks ago now, I kind of mockingly kind of talked about that kind of silly aspect of it because there's a lot of rubbish on YouTube and it merges into kind of zombies and possession and ghosts and stuff like that, which lessens the very seriousness of the subject. And so you're going to take us back to this very real aspect of the Third Reich that did embrace all sorts of weird and wonderful things from Germany's past to create its hold over its people, I guess.
Yeah, I think what I've tried. Oh no, I wanted to call this applied occultism, in the sense that we were going from actual occultist behavior to actually how it's applied into the military structure, the state structures, leadership, and all of that stuff. But I'm not sure applied is the correct word. It's like a culturalization of occultism without actually being occultism. It's symbolism and a range of other factors, which I hope we're going to be able to chat through today.
Yeah, well, let's get going. So, folks, at the score with Dr. Blood, there'll be a lot of complicated themes, but usually most of the stuff is covered as we move along. But of course, we welcome comments and questions, even if we can't get to them all. But over to you. Let's look at this.
Okay, so as usual, books that I use for this kind of thing: Victor Klemperer, The Language of the Third Reich, which I recommend to everybody to understand German Nazi wordology and speaking. George Moss's The Crisis of German Ideology, which you'd think would not be appropriate to this, but actually he was one of the first to incorporate ideas of the occult and naturism and paganism into the general ideology. And Eric Hobsbawm, because we are in the world of invention and reinventing traditions and recreating history. So they're three good books. And the kind of words that we or the questions that we're having in our mind in this one is the history of politics, the politics of history, but the critical reoccurring themes, which you'll see as we go forward, how certain themes, certain aspects of German history are brought back to serve a purpose at the hands of the Nazis. If we move on. So what I've done for the first few slides is actually take what was very popular in the 1990s, which is a series of television programs. Here we've got in 1990 Michael Wood, and by the way, I picked the three programs which you can find on YouTube. So I've used the screen prints from YouTube. People can go and see them and listen and see what the historians have to say. Michael Wood is an archaeologist and a great historian, ancient historian. And a lot of his work I've read, but most of it nothing to do with Nazis. When he produced this, it was very interesting. He tied ideology, history, archaeology, and occultism, and came up with some very interesting ideas about how the Nazis were using occultism and the search for the Holy Grail in terms of in search of the master race. So if we move on to the next one. Now, here's somebody I really do enjoy. He's Jonathan Meades. He came up with a program called Jerry Building, which was really, I suppose you would say, taking the mickey out of the Nazis from an architectural perspective. And you can see I've highlighted some of the things that he said in the talk, which was Nazism was a neo-paganism sect, imposing the past on the present, mythical bullshit. But the one thing that he did say, which fascinated me then and now, was he suggested that Ian Fleming, the guy who wrote the James Bond book, had said when he was an intelligence officer that when Rudolf Hess landed in Britain, the first person to interrogate him should have been Aleister Crowley. Now, for the aficionados who don't know who Aleister Crowley is, he's one of these clique of individuals who, at the turn of the century, who came up with ideas, occult ideas and practices, and one of them was the Order of the Golden Dawn. Now, I'm not going to go into explanations of all of this Order of the Golden Dawn, but I've noted, I put in all the details there. So anybody who's interested in this, they'll find pages in Wikipedia and elsewhere. So,
and just thank you for reminding me about Jonathan Meades, because I used to watch his programs all the time. And then I've just, in seeing your slide, I realized you don't see him anymore. There was a big part of my kind of early 20s and 30s, I guess, that because he would cover some very, very odd subjects, but always in that completely unique way he would. So thank you for a bit of nostalgia there, Phil.
I mean, the great thing about Jonathan in that program, and I'm not going to be a complete spoiler, but he actually, where you have that British film where they, the Lambeth Walk, where the Nazis are marching. Is it the Lambeth Walk where the Nazis are marching up and down in craziness?
Yeah.
What he does, he puts the same film to Greek music and says the Nazis all wanted to be Greek. So it's quite entertaining stuff, but he has a punch at the end, and I'm not going to spoil that. But if we move on, and now Adam Curtis, he kind of spans from the 80s to present day. But in 1995, he picked up this, put forward this broadcast called The Living Dead, which initially looked at the Nazis and questioned certain things. One of the most incredible things he questioned at that time was the failure of the Nazi trials. And he claimed dangerous ideas had been locked away by the Allies, that the Nazis' body national was not examined during the Nuremberg trial, and that the Nazis were depicted as monsters rather than the actions of ordinary human beings. And it's very interesting, he picked on Göring, who obviously with my research on birds of prey and the role of the Luftwaffe in the Holocaust, it became a certain interest to me. And you can see that Göring went forward with the forest, and I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later. But some of these images that he was using to show that paganism was part of everyday life in Nazi Germany isn't exactly true, but it's not completely false. You know, it's one of those that these things did happen in the 1930s, but once war started, they completely vanished because it was no longer expedient to have that kind of behavior. But anyway, let's move on. If you would go back to the normal German history of German national identity, the common themes are Tacitus and Germania. Tacitus was the Roman philosopher who published a piece of work called Germania, in which he discussed the great forests and the German people. And obviously, as Germany became closer and closer up until 1870, an individual nation, a united nation, Tacitus became very interesting to people and German national identity and the quest for a national identity. And of course, if you look at the flag from 1870, another side of what's happening in Germany at that stage is the conventional political religiosity. Gott mit uns was engraved into the German military order. So you've got religion, politics, all combined. And at the same time, you've got the idea that Arminius, you know, the man who beat Varus and destroyed the Roman army and the Roman legions in Germany, being used as a monument to German nationalism and German national identity. This is all very much happening long before the occult movement is having any effect in Germany. At this stage, the occult is very much on the fringe of things. So if we move on.
And just a quick question or comment: is the occult was also, it wasn't something that was exclusively being dabbled with in Germany at this time. I mean, I'm thinking back at the Victorians in the UK were crazy interested in this stuff, and America went through that. So it's not like this was a reserve of only of this part of Europe. There was a real fascination. It was that, you know, the era of the the Ouija boards and people, you know, even later into the 20th century, kind of getting involved in this scamming of people and confidence and speaking to the dead. So I think everybody had a fascination with this stuff on some level at this time.
But if you're setting the environment, the landscape in which Germany is emerging into the modern world, the occultism is coming in parallel with this change. And I've said, you know, here the spectre of modernity. So at the beginning of the 19th century, you got Caspar David Friedrich producing these wonderful artworks of Germans looking at their landscape. By the end, in 1900, you've got this situation where the Siemens factory, overcrowding and slums in the cities, and that's putting huge pressure on the nation and the nation's resources. And of course, that's pushing towards empire and expansionism and those ideas. So if we just move on. So there is a dark democracy in the sense that the ideological cliques are monitoring around at this time. Several of them are following the occult movement. And as you can see here, here's four of the most famous names in the occult movement: Guido von List, Helena Petrova Blavatsky, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, known for his racism, and Jörg Lanz. The interesting thing about these guys is not so much the wacky theories. I particularly find the world ice theory fairly interesting, but it's the merger of occultism with racism. So you have the myth of the Aryan in parallel with the rise of anti-Semitism. You have the world ice theory and theosophy being trumped as truth being more important to religion. So you have a counter to religion. And there at the top of that photo, of that picture, of that badge, you see a reverse swastika. So there's an awful lot of information coming into these cliques. But let me just get one thing across here. It's highly unlikely that the working class would have the time for this. A, because they're working in demanding circumstances in the factories. But second, they're not going to be part of this regime. The regime of these ideological cliques is to create a form of excellence amongst themselves and a certain select group of individuals. So there is a form of selection here, perhaps even ideas coming from Darwin's Origin of Species, where there is an element of selection and master races. And that's emerging from this. So you have this myth of the Aryan emerging at a time when Darwin, the problems in German society, the rise of empire, the political structures which are failing to hold together democracy, it's a very harsh time for the German people.
And I suppose that in that era, science itself was perceived in some ways as a kind of a dark, evil force, as it is to some extent today in 2025, with people, you know, claiming that scientists are Satanists and that. So in an era when, in the early 20th century, the world is learning a lot about itself. Physics is being understood. The scientists and the people who are practicing perhaps the dark, there's a connection between them in that they're generally being viewed by the public as something a little bit odd. Does that make sense?
Well, in the one sense, you've got scientists who are making remarkable developmental changes to overall society, but at the same time, you've got factories like Siemens that producing the clothes that Hewitt Stewart Chamberlain is wearing, and so there is nobody's thinking about too much about how much they are engaging with the modernity. They're complaining about modernity. They're complaining that their landscapes, their forest of Caspar David Friedrich has been destroyed by environmental pollution and all kinds of impairment. But by the same token, they're buying the products. So
Yeah.
it's a kind of a confused hypocrisy, which of course we see today when someone's saying, well, you know, I'm going to only use an electric car. All of those parts coming from exploited Africa. So you end up in a roundabout situation. It's all, you know, very difficult. So if we move on to the next one. So here we get into a bit of war now, where Imperial Germany has gone to war. And it's not the fact that they've just gone to war. It's the fact that they've gone to war, a total war, and they've come out with total defeat. And that sees certain things happen that, for example, defeat is turned into a pivotal political issue. And that's not just the fact that the Treaty of Versailles has taken away large lumps of German territory or the reduction of the army to 100,000 men. It's the fact that that's imposed a political vacuum on Germany with the abdication of the Kaiser. So Germany in 1918 is a very strange place. On one hand, you've got people writing popular military history, which has Jesus on the front line. At the same time, you've got sculptors who are still using old German army images for memorials on the graves of German soldiers. And at the same time, the belt buckle has still got mit uns. So you even though you've had the imperial eagle and crown, you've now got the Weimar crown, eagle, carrying the same symbol. So although Germany is no longer the Germany of pre-1914, there's features within German society and culture which are continuing. And it's these two parallels, the old Germany and the new Germany, that start to clash. And that's a very important factor in how occultism is then used for political means. So with all of these strange orders and Freikorps and Black Corps and you name it going around, and the hunters and the foresters all doing their thing, there's one order that comes out which is kind of representative of all of the occult groups and strange movements that occur at this time, and that's the Thule Society. Now, various people have come up with the idea that Thule Society came around in 1912, then again in 1918, but it definitely vanished in 1925, or so we were led to believe. And the leading individual was Theodor Fritsch. They were Munich high society, and you can see from the membership, wealthy industrialists, aristocrats, and middle-class professions. No space for the working class mass. So the riffraff are kept out of this. This is very much an elitist idea. And Thule is this island, this mythical island where Germanism comes from, Germanic order comes from, a search for Atlantis, if you like. But also, there underneath all of this is the concept of the Aryan race. And that's becoming more and more prominent in all of these movements. So if we just move on to the next one. Now, in 1925, the Thule Society goes down the pan. Now, what we see happen, which is very common with the Nazis, is they straight away strip the carcass. And the carcass here is the Volkische Beobachter, which is the newspaper of the Thule Society, which our old friend Ritter von Epp, if you remember the Rommel talk, Ritter von Epp was Rommel's field commander. He stepped in and rescued the newspaper, took it from the Thule Society and gave it to the Nazis, and was, for a long time, up until the Nazis came to power, the power broker within this vacuum that emerged after 1918. So Ritter von Epp is playing all cards to whichever way deals his best hand. So on the one hand, you see him supporting a monarchist movement, and he would himself be a monarchist. His whole upbringing, his whole life, up until 1918, was in a royalist army, monarchist background, and of course he's a knight, Ritter von Epp. But you also see a little while later, he's kind of cashed all of that in and become one of Hitler's leading acolytes. And that shift is quite something. And you see that shift happen so often in the rise of National Socialism. They've taken something from the Thule Society, which really should have just disappeared. But they've seen an opportunity, they've acquired something from it, and that Thule Society is going to come back later, as I will show you. So, because we haven't done this before, I thought we'd talk about the Stahlhelm, the Legion of Front Soldiers. It's a subject that not many people want to talk about because they seem like a crazy organization of a bit like the British Legion with uniforms running around on former battlefields and places, being soldiers. But the story here is the concept of the front soldier, which has been so incorporated into Nazi thinking with Ernst Röhm and the Sturmabteilung, the stormtroopers, and all of these strange organizations which say they're front ready and they're ready to be comrades at the front and blah blah. This organization goes for a process of transformation and goes from, having been at the front, celebrating the front, to producing a set of books when Hitler comes to power. And this is quite remarkable. They've got their own publishing house, they've got a massive following, and they produce 2-volume books, as you can see them. And I put there the case of political stupidity. And the case of political stupidity is, where have they placed the Nazi swastika?
Right, at the feet, under.
In the claw of an imperial eagle.
Yeah.
They ain't going to last. That is the nature of political naivety, to not only misunderstand what Hitler is about, but at the same time suggest that the crown is going to come back and Hitler's going to allow it. Yeah. And there it is in everyone's face. So you go from volume 1, which is fairly representative of the 1980s soldier, the German imperial colors, and then suddenly they've reawakened it with the rising eagle. It's an eagle that's rising. And that's bizarre. That's bizarre. So we need to have a look at what actually happens with this lot. So if we move on to the next one.
Yep.
Now, the fascinating thing about this group of guys is they form up in 1919, 1920, and they reinvent the imperial tradition. So they can't go to Aachen because Aachen's under Belgian occupation. So you couldn't go back to Charlemagne or Karl de Grosse because you can't access it. And the Belgians will not allow access of German front soldiers into its occupied zone. So Magdeburg, which is the burial place of Otto I the Great, becomes the place for flag investiture during their foundation process. But they couldn't afford any cameras, and they didn't replay it, so they got some artists to draw the investiture of the flag, which is central to the first book and the first story. And the flag that's being invested is the national banner, which you can see here. And you can see very clearly, there's the eagle. It's really an imperial old German eagle, recognizable for the Imperial German Army of the period 19th century up to 1918. And here's the thing. They all go off to celebrate Arminius, which we saw earlier, raised by Kaiser Wilhelm. And it's an again, because it's come back again. And there it is. They're celebrating Arminius. So German history, it doesn't matter how much reinvention is taking place in one aspect, they're still going back to another part of German history to reawaken themselves, to push. And of course, we know these stories, in America, it's make Germany great again. Here we're into, make America great again. But the MAGA thing. Whereas over in Germany, it's awakening, this whole process of awakening. And to be seen to be awakening is to go back and celebrate the old heroes like Arminius, Germania, and Otto I. So if we move on. So what you actually see is how the flags suddenly kind of merge with the Nazi swastika, and then the soldiers, the front soldiers, who didn't wear swastikas during the Great War, are suddenly wearing swastikas when they're marching at a Nazi rally. And what's interesting here is you're actually going in through a form of cultural militarization transformation where the notion of the nation in arms, which is central to the old German Imperial Army, has now gone to the Führer and the nation. And the Führer is more important. Can you see? He's coming.
Mm-hmm.
And so, being Hitler, and now he's the boss of this organization, he immediately disbands it in 1935. So as you can see, they've created books about themselves, which have led to their own disbandment. So if we move on.
Just a quick question from John there. Why not celebrate Charlemagne, given that the Holy Roman Empire was essentially German?
Because you can't get in the chapel.
Okay.
It's under Belgian occupation. And Belgium is never, ever going to allow anybody in large numbers like that come and parade in the chapel. And also there's competing ownership of it. Plus, people like Konrad Adenauer and others are having political uprisings in the Rhineland to try and break away from Germany. So it's not an easy situation to just go and play the Charlemagne card.
Okay.
Otto I, he's in safe country, and he's a good enough person to put your flag over.
Okay, makes sense.
So what's actually has happened with the dismissal of this Stahlhelm is you've ended tradition. So you've gone from royalty to cultism. And what you can see here is Crown Prince, on the picture with the three men, you've got Crown Prince Wilhelm of Prussia, who believed to 1935 that Hitler was going to give in to royalty. You've got Ernst Röhm, who is still alive before 1934, and von Papen, who was Hitler's first, second Führer, Chancellor, sorry. So you can see there that there was, people would say there was a game plan. I don't believe there is. Rome was using the Crown Prince as much as the Crown Prince was using Rome, and Papen was using both of them because that's the nature of the German politics at that time. But what is more fascinating is how royalty shifts quickly. You either go into obscurity like Crown Prince Wilhelm did, or like Karl Edward Herzog von Saxon, Coburg and Gotha, you join the SS. So he's gone from being the founder chief, whatever it is, the godfather, if you like, of the Stahlhelm in the uniform on one side, to the SS uniform, and he's accepted all of that, including a swastika on his chest. Yeah, that's a shift, because you can't see a swastika on the first picture, which is actually from the final Stahlhelm book. Yeah, you see that shift? That's fascinating. He knows the politics that's coming, and he's played his card. He's also, as I understand it, related to Queen Victoria and the British royal family, which is why he was actually christened Leopold Charles Edward George Albert. But then that's another story. So if we move on. So this is the thing. Up until this point, occultism has been in the, if you like, the fringe, the edges of the dark democracy that's been emerging from the latter half of the 19th century. And what you have with the rise of Hitler is this face in the crowd, a political journey which is fairly rapid. It's very symbolic. You can see certain things happening and occurring, which you know, Hoffman identifies this photograph from 1914, which was taken by chance. Then there's the famous picture from pre-1923 in the putsch. And then there's a later picture with him with the blood flag from the Julian putsch, wiping it onto the flags of the standards of the Sturmabteilung before he destroyed them in 1934. What's more fascinating is the Bannerträger, which is a painting which was created by Hubert Lanzinger. Now, most histories don't ever focus on the artist. They always focus on this picture of Hitler dressed in his armor and holding the Nazi flag, marching forward as the standard bearer of the Nazi Reich. Hubert Lanzinger is very interesting because he was taught in the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, where Hitler had failed to be accepted. So, in a sense, the old history, his old past, is being repainted, if you like that term. And he's being recreated by an artist who had actually worked in the First World War and the press department, producing propaganda pictures for the German army. And then later, what you actually find very common is these bronze busts of Hitler for people's desks and people's shelves. So what you have is the immortal bronze, like there is a permanence to this. So the cult of the sacred leader has shifted, but they've created this imagery of him as this leader of a paganistic cult organization, which would then go back to what Jonathan Meades and Michael Wood was saying, that occultism was being internalized within the Nazi regime in ways that when you first look at it, you think, well, that's a bit odd, guys in armor. But when you tie it back to the process that they've been through with the Thule Society, with the Great War, with how they've taken over and absorbed the Stahlhelm, Nazified it, then got rid of it. You know, this is an organization which knows how to use anything that fits its program, its agenda for advancement. I'm just going to take a quick mouthful.
No worries. All good stuff. We're loving it. And folks, I will address some of your questions later on, some of the bigger ones.
How are we doing for time? Are we okay?
We're good. We're fine. Half an hour in. Yeah, we're good.
Oh, cool. Okay. Because I was hoping that we could have some conversation with all of this. So anyway, we come to Hitler's imagination. And we go back to what Adam Curtis's, one of the interviewees, who was Göring's translator. And he came up with the Nazi body national. It's the idea that the body on Earth, the biological body, is more powerful than the gods, and that the body, the human body, is representative of the future. That's fine. You've removed all the moral religiosity by taking away religion, and you end up with this barren man standing with his torch. And I've used again the two pictures from the place where you visited, and you saw it when you were at university, at the Adolf Hitler University in the Eifel with me. And you can see now that Hitler is no longer just one knight in shining armor. There's others. Yeah. The two pictures in black and white, the Nazi with the swastika riding alongside the Germanic knight. So the shift in the occult, because you've got this man with his standard, with his torch from the solstice, summer solstice celebrations, is now working alongside the Germanic knight, the Nazi hero, on a university site, which is for the proliferation of Nazi ideology. And if you'd have looked at some of the books and pamphlets that were in that collection, in that museum, you would have seen things like, well, Christmas was always Germanic, it was always pagan, and Jesus was German. well, okay, fine, Jesus was a Germanic hero. How they get to those things, it's quite a complex argument, and you read the papers and what have you. But the fact of the matter is, when you get down to the crux, this is about power. And it's the use of the occult for the furtherance of power, not using the occult, not using power to get to the occult. There's a difference. Yeah?
Right.
So if we move on. So what you actually find now is this bizarre situation where Gott mit uns is removed from the Luftwaffe and the Waffen-SS belt buckles, and you see a new militarism. And God's being removed from them, not only being removed from the belt buckles, but he's being removed, gradually sidelined within German society. And you actually have Catholic priests raising their arms to National Socialism here in this picture with Joseph Goebbels. And what there is an end of religion, but there's an end of something else too, which people often forget. Germany was deeply buried in Kantian order. So things like where the Bible has suggested there's 10 commandments, Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, comes along and says there's right ways of living, there's ethics, there's moralities. A lot of this is now getting wiped away. So you're not only getting rid of the 10 commandments, you're getting rid of certain structures which have held German society together, even during the dark times when they were a divided nation of many states. We're now into a kind of a paganism coming into everyday society without anybody actually voting for it. It's not like you'd say, okay, I want to be a pagan tomorrow. I'm going to give up my Catholicism. That's not happened. It's just been imposed from above. And suddenly, if you join an organization, you join the Luftwaffe, you're joining a belt buckle which is celebrating the eagle, the swastika, and the German forest, the laurel leaves.
Mm.
Yeah, that doesn't appear to be a major shift in idea, but to actually have removed God from the belt buckle puts your soul towards a different command. If you fight for God and country, what are you fighting for now? Führer, nation, the body national, and that has taken away certain commonalities with other nations. So the armed forces, if you would say the British Army, God, Queen, and country. Same with the French, same with the Italians. Now Germany is looking at something very, very different, an entirely weird military culture within a society which is going completely in a cultural direction which nobody had ever thought they would ever go in. If you'd have said in 1928 to people, if you vote for Hitler, you're going to get institutional occultism, they'd think you were crazy. They would really do think you were crazy. But by the end, they're looking at it and saying, wow, what have we been through? So if we move on to the next one. So the two leading guys, Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Göring, here's Himmler reinventing history, actually reincarnating himself as Henry the Fowler, a late medieval German king. He's going through a process here. He acquires the Webelsburg Castle, which I've visited a couple of times. It's not the most exciting place. I don't mean that in a nasty way, because they actually do good work for the history in the past. It's just, you can't imagine somebody like Himmler putting his faith on that place, basically because there are fault lines which link to some higher order of Thule, I suppose. He hasn't gone to Marienburg, the famous castle, or as it's known today, Malbork, which is just incredible. It's just a remarkable Teutonic castle. He's abandoned all of that, and he's come to this falsy castle built later. And he's gone through this process of building up an invented history of what the Nazis and the SS are going to be under his way of thinking. There's multiple rivals in this in this game, as we'll see later. So if we move on. So he decides to go down the ancestral heritage route, which is the SS Ahnenerbe, which is basically taking all the professors and culturalists from German universities and colleges and institutes to create some knowledge of what is behind the existence of the master race. And he uses history and archaeology. So here we are directly in line now with what Michael Wood was talking about. And if you look in that program, you'll see Wolfram Sievers, who is the chief of the Ahnenerbe, and Karl Maria Willigut, who is responsible for some of the things that come into this. I mean, there's not a lot to say about these two guys other than, you know, Willigut was taken out of a mental home before he was put into the SS. He was known for deranged behavior. And Sievers was eventually found guilty at Nuremberg and was hanged. During the time that this thing existed, they had a monthly journal. This is from 1935, where they would look at Germanic prehistory, which sounds kind of odd. How do you do prehistory? Well, they're looking at the time before writing and runes and all of that. And it's hard to describe how much of it is just nonsense. I mean, Michael Wood claimed there were moments when famous scholars contributed, but at the same time, you know, they'd go and find a piece of pot in a forest somewhere, scratch a swastika on it and say, well, you know, that just shows that they were Nazis back in the time 1,000 years before Charlemagne. What is perhaps memorable, which isn't often discussed, but is known to have been in a film, I believe, is Bruno Bega in The Search for the Aryan Man. He went on the trip to Tibet, and there he is examining somebody. And of course, they do this examination of heads and things, not just in their search for the Aryan Man, but they also do it to discover and identify Jews within the community for racial exceptionalism and removal from society. So you look at one thing, there's something else also going on in that. Yeah. So if we move on, I've taken some of what Willigut was putting forward, and one of them is the Totenkopf ring. The Totenkopf ring was worn by all these SS officers. I've taken Michael Wittmann, the famous tank commander, to show that he was a Totenkopf ring holder.
Right.
I've taken from his personnel file. You'll see the runes being studied by a group of academics from the SS with all their heads turned because they don't want to be identified. And then you've got these weird Nordic horns, which I've not heard, but apparently don't sound very nice. But anyway, I don't know. There's only so much. But the thing that the SS is coming out of here is the cultural guardians of the National Socialist Order. Yeah. So I know I talked about the leadership, the way the SS leadership went one way, about the Waffen-SS and the way it went. Now we're looking at the SS overall in the period just before and into the war, where they've created these symbols and aspects of their organizational culture to create their purpose, which is the guardian of the National Socialist Order and German culture. So if we move on. And of course, you see it coming out again in Waffen-SS divisional signals. In a sense, it's an operational occultism. You can see with the swastikas being used multiple times. I actually find the swords more interesting because you have Siegfried's sword, you have the sword, what it represents as a phallic symbol, and you know, you can go down a whole long story of different swords and different styles, but they're featuring there. I marked them out in green and in red as being very significant to the symbolic order that Himmler is trying to create from within the troops at the ground level. So, you know, you used to get people say, well, I'm writing a book about the Waffen-SS, but I'm not going to do anything about the politics or any of the ideology stuff. Well, excuse me, how do you escape it? Because it's there. Yeah, it's in your face. So there it is. Not much more to be said about it. I'm sure we all know all those symbols.
Yep.
Let's move on. Come more interesting for me was one day working in a file, I found this Croatia drawing from 1942 of rituals of death. It surprised me because I never expected to be finding this kind of thing. This was from a Waffen-SS soldier, just an ordinary man, who doodled this lithograph, and it had caught the attention of the SS Ahnenerbe, and it was then promoted right the way around the regime in various parts. It just fascinated me that such a drawing, which is obviously rituals of death, was now being used by the SS. So you'd had one form of occultism, which had been the master race, the rise of the great Germanic people. Now you're seeing rituals of death coming into the process. And that's a little shift. That's an important shift. And in 1944, you begin to see medals which are ritualizing killing. This is the Bandenbekämpfung, Abzeichen, the medal given to the soldiers or men who fought in the war against the partisans. And if you remember, when I did Bandenbekämpfung talk, I mentioned it there. What you see here again, and it's another recurring theme, is we now see the Thule swastika and the sword being reversed against the hydra of the partisans. Yeah. So somewhere along the line, somebody has remembered, oh, we can use the Thule symbol and reuse it now and retool it for this. And so the cultural guardianship during operations is quite significant. On the ground, there's soldiers and men who are coming up with fantastic images of the ritualization of death, while at the same time, the uniforms are getting awards for extreme behavior. Yeah. So,
yeah.
So let's go to sadly became one of my more prominent individuals, because I spent a lot of time working on him, and that's Hermann Göring, Hitler's paladin. Now, the thing about Göring, as I keep saying, is he isn't a fat oaf. This guy is a very clever individual, and nowhere have I been able to find, up until 1919, was Göring into occultism.
Right.
Yeah. So if you look at the uniform on the left, the black and white, there he is, Paul Emerit as a fighter pilot. He's got the swastika on his helmet. He's got the swastika on his armband. He's accepted the culture. But if you go to his painting, when he is now the second man in Germany, the painting from 1938, you see the forest combined with the Luftwaffe, combined with the Paul Emerit, all put together with his Prussian hat, because he was the minister president of Prussia. So you see two different political messages. And at the same time, when he's building the Luftwaffe, his swords of the officers have the Thule swastika. So he hasn't gone the full hog down that kind of occultist Thule route, but he has played to it. So if we move on. So here we come to my other favourite chap from the Luftwaffe, Adolf Garland. And here you can see him waving his arm, which of course he said to Hamilton, the film director of the Battle of Britain, that he never did. So there he is doing what he never did. What's interesting about this picture is it's the arrival of Hitler to France to pay a visit to Garland's squadrons. Now, here you see how enthusiastic the Luftwaffe is at the arrival of the Führer, this sacred man. Yeah. So you have to see that. 1935, there is that knight in shining armor, and the Luftwaffe are really looking forward to a visit from the man. But what's going on in this? Well, if you went to Luftwaffe spiritualism, you know that Göring had a fascination with the golden bow, which became their golden Zweig. And the interesting thing there is what comes out of it is the eternal forest. And Göring's film in 1935, which, if you remember from Adam Curtis, when Göring created all of his things, was The Forest, and the Forest film from 1935, that features certain aspects. First of all, it goes back to Germania. And as I said, the recurring theme of the forest reawakened again. But at the same time, the forests are protective zones for animals, for the great hunters to hunt and to be Germanic master race. And of course, the symbol of that is when you kill the deer, the stag, you walk around prominently with the horns. And this is prominent within Luftwaffe culture. So they've embraced this spiritualism of the internal forest. Now, I know a few people think I'm kind of Lulu on this because I do a lot of hunting and forestry research, but let's go dig a little bit further and go to the next one. So here we find that the Luftwaffe has a problem with the spectre of modernity. Imagine, spectre of modernity. It's a spectre of modernity because you're on the one hand, you're promoting the forest and hunting, but at the same time, you need really advanced aircraft to win the war. So your propaganda is for these fantastic aircraft, and you get Hannah Reich to wave her arm around and wear Nazi symbols, but at the same time, you're absorbing slaves. You're using slave labor, to build the aircraft. So while you've got the ethics of the military ethics that you think of the Luftwaffe as just an ordinary German Air Force, which is building aeroplanes to fight and shoot down Lancasters and fortresses, on the other hand, it's actually being fueled and put together on the basis of slave labor. So the ethical arguments of the spiritualism of the forest is only limited to a small group of Germans, the Germanic, the Aryan, Jews, Slavs, anybody outside of that circuit. They're prone to either being killed or serving in this horrible scenario of having to manufacture airplane parts. And in many cases, they use women for the small parts because they could get their fingers in, but often the poor people had to have all this aviation fuel poured over them hands, and it was burning them. I mean, some of the stories are just horrendous. Anyway, let's not stay there. Let's go on. If you're going to have high performance aircraft, you have to test human endurance. And we're back to modernity again. And here, modernity is how long can a Jew last in a pressure chamber? Now, we know that Dr. Sigmund Reich was doing the experiments in Dachau. What people don't realize is there were Luftwaffe doctors behind all of these tests, and they were filming them. And the results came out in September 1942, which is a very interesting period because the German armed forces were targeting towards Stalingrad. They were having a ding-dong battle in the Atlantic, U-boats and Allied convoys, and also the fighting in the desert. So what does occultism do? It says we have to bind the nation. So what happens in September 1942? We go on to the next one. Göring kills 4 stags, one of them Matador. and he creates a ritual sacrifice at the time for the abyss. Attending this hunting sacrifice were many of the doctors who were involved in the pressure tests. Göring had received the report on the pressure test a day or two before. He'd also spent a couple of days before this event with Himmler talking about radicalizing the Holocaust and advancing the final solution far quicker. And if you remember my talk on birds of prey, from this moment on, the troops in the forest of Białowieża were told to kill as many Jews as possible to clear the forest, and especially those Jews who were escaping from camps like Treblinka, or the trains that were going to Treblinka, and to escape from death. These were now the hunters. And as you can see, what's remarkable about this film is Göring has got the main press cameramen to make a film for the legacy of the nation. So they're filming the rituals of the killing of these stags at the same time as having made the decision to go with the final solution. Big time. So you've now crossed the Rubicon, in a sense. You have no morality left. You've worn it away. It's all gone. Some of it's going to be has gone because of the occultism, but because of the Nazi agenda, the race hatred, the master race concepts, all of those have swung now into an aggressive fashion. And 1942 is the start of the drift towards the horror. I mean, it's been fairly bad anyway. Now it's going to get worse.
Yeah.
And we go on. So we come to the spectre of defeat again, because in 1918-17 they were in the spectre of defeat. Now we're back in that situation, and Hitler's called on apoplectic war. Now the problem with this for many people in doing military history is, what does that actually mean in real practice? And we tend to think about, the hard fighting in Normandy, the hard fighting in Bagration, some of which I've previously talked about on the programs. But if we look down, and we now drill down, we see the church at Oradour.
Yep.
Now the SS division, Das Reich, has gone to that area and placed all the women and children in that place and set it alight. Now, there is no religiosity anymore, and the church then becomes something that's evil to the pagans. So burning a whole load of French civilians in a church is no longer a moral issue. It's something that we have to do because we are Nazis. And that's a terrible thing to imagine.
My God, yeah.
And then they not only do it on one front, they do it in Warsaw. And this is the church where Heinz Reinhardt, if you remember when I was talking about the destruction of Warsaw, the Nazis have gone to Warsaw and done the same thing. And it's not just German soldiers and Waffen-SS. It's all the forces that have been involved have committed to the most heinous crimes. And then, the Luftwaffe's at it in Monte Cassino. Okay, Monte Cassino is bombed by the Allies. There's lots of rubberization. But the Luftwaffe didn't have to fight in that place. They elected to fight there. They didn't care that the place was trashed. But what they did do, which is often forgotten, was they took all the trophies out, and Göring had them taken to his marvelous Karen Hall and Remington homes. So you think that there's an ordinary fight there, but actually, by taking out the artwork, first of all, that's to the benefit of Göring and the Reich, but at the same time, by removing all that religiosity, it just becomes bare-bone building. Yeah, so they're actually clearing religious artifacts to fight in, buildings to fight in, and that is now showing that the occultism has driven these men through the lack of morality, lack of ethics in war, to fighting in the most extreme places in the extreme manner. And this is a side of the Nazi model, the Nazi game, which a lot of people have tended to misunderstand. It's part of the main war effort. No one is going to prosecute. I can't remember his name for a moment. Derricks of Orador, because he's done something.
Diekman. Adolf Diekman.
Because he's done something which is within the parameters of Nazi occultism. He has burnt, sacrificed French lives in a church. That's staggering.
Crikey, yeah. No, when you put it like that, yeah. Good grief. Whew.
So then you come in 1945, the spell's broken. Yeah. The final mission of the Aryan man is actually to just die. And they do. They commit suicide. Göring cheats the hangman and very clearly, but tried to defend his case, which very few of them did. But he really did try to defend his case, and he fought his corner. The interesting thing about all these Nazis dying is no Nazi ever capitulated, technically. So the German state surrendered because a few German generals signed orders of unconditional surrender.
Yep.
But there were no state officials at those signings. So technically, the Nazi Third Reich never surrendered. Technically, I mean, it did. Obviously, it was just defeated and conquered.
Yeah.
But people like Göring fought to the bitter end for his story. That's a fascinating,
It is. You're making my brain hurt.
I mean, that goes back to what Adam Curtis was saying, that this guy was never really judged. He was never really taken apart for his beliefs. He was taken apart for the Allies to have a story of how they took him apart. And I have some sympathy with Adam Curtis's argument. I mean, the fact that Baksalevsky lied in the court to Göring and Göring called him a swine. I mean, I've written about that and it's on Academia if anybody wants to read the paper. I mean, but the point here is, was that contrived? I think it was. I think it was a smokescreen. Nobody was then taking any interest in Göring. And if Baksalevsky is true to his word, which of course he wasn't for 99.9% of the time, but if he was on that occasion, he got the poison to Göring. And then that story continues. As you can see, Panzermeier, when he died, they put oak leaves all over his coffin, and there's a former memorial of I think it was the 12th SS Panzer Division. What actually happened at the end in 1945 was like this chap here who's scrawled out the eyes of Hitler and shot himself. I think he's probably a Nazi Gauleiter of thought. The point is, without the sacred Führer, what is there? There's nothing. And that nothingness, that numbness of nothingness, fills many of these Nazis with no hope. They have no future beyond the death of the Führer. And that raises so many interesting questions about what really was National Socialism. And I would go back to what Jonathan Meades says. Fleming recognized that this was an occult government. And this is what occultism really means. It's not the practice of Ouija boards and funny cards and all the rest of it. It's how the politics is played out through the use of occultist symbols and iconography, until the belief and the faith in whatever, in this case Hitler, is worn away because he's no longer there. But if he's alive, imagine what these people do. Well, you can imagine it, because they burn people in churches, they sacrifice deers, they put people in slave labor camps. That's the inevitability of believing some of these wacky theories about the master race and Aryanism. So if we go to the next one.
Yeah, no. Then we've got some questions.
And so, historians like myself, academics, we think the judgment of history is the crimes against humanity. And the crimes against humanity started a long, long time before the Nazis came to power. That's a painful thing to think about. And that's not blaming the German people for being, I don't know, on some kind of Sonderweg. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the ideas, those political ideas of the master race, the Aryan society, Thule, all of this stuff, generated ideas that became part of the basic culture of the system, of the society of the Third Reich, which led to the crimes against humanity. And I think it's fascinating. A lot of people say, well, you know, so-and-so's a Nazi, this person's a Nazi. I don't think they are, because what actually happens after the spell is broken is all this occultism just vanishes. Different occultism fills its space because there's a vacuum, like there always is.
Yeah.
But it's not the same level of hocus pocus.
Brilliant. Well, let's leave out your link there so people can discover more of your work there. So that's the link to Phil's Substack and the 4 books. And of course, you can search back on the previous World War II TV content for more of Dr. Phil's brain muddling but brilliant theorizing. But let's deal with some questions, Phil, before we leave. So right early on, how connected do you think the pre-Nazi ideas of Ostsiedlung and Bismarck's anti-Polish culture camp are with Nazi ideas of Lebensraum?
There are parallels, there are links, but with Bismarck, with the culture Kampf, you're dealing with, to a certain extent, the fight against Catholicism, and that's from a Protestant fighting Catholicism. If you know, in the binary way of looking at things. And Eastern settlement had been going on ever since the Teutonic Knights. There's always been these moves towards expansion of German Empire, for example. There are some links, but they're not that specific. I wouldn't put Bismarck down as the origins of Nazi Lebensraum.
Okay, thank you. We've got some more. Ian Carr asked very early on about Habsburg tradition, whether there's any connection there with myths in the occult.
Well, it's very interesting that the Bannerträger, artist Hubert, what's his face, he came from the Habsburg monarchy, and his ideas are Habsburg. So the idea of putting Hitler in armor like that has to have some Habsburg background. Whether all of the traditions have come into it, I don't know. When I looked and examined the crowd of Reinhardt SS commanders who were Camps Reinhardt, you know, Treblinka and those, an awful lot of them all came from Austria, but none of them were of the level in the Habsburg monarchy to have made much a difference whether they've been involved in the Habsburg traditions. So,
okay. Jim Walsh made the point about and I think he was kind of being semi-jokey but semi-serious, drug taking. There's been the whole discussions about pervitin and assault troops and things like that. But during this occultism phase, is there drug use? Is there substance abuse that's in any way assisting this?
It's hard to say. I mean, the Göring's drug regime is caused by his wounding in 1923, and he becomes dependent on morphia.
Yeah.
I don't think he was taking morphia when he was doing his Matador thing and the sacrifice in 42. I think to a certain extent he'd been reduced and he was just using barbiturates. There is a sense that Hitler, in a lot of what he was doing, was taking drugs, but to line up drug taking with occultism, I don't think is what I was talking about. I think I was talking about how occultism was taken from the idea and put into practicality, like belt buckles and everyday life. And, yeah.
Peter O'Connell, big question, potentially big answer, but we'll try and do it rather quickly. How much was the Nazi leader cult a core belief versus a tool to gain and maintain power, or is it both?
Bit of both, I would have thought. The thing is with these guys is power is the main aim. Doctrine is only dogma, ideology, whatever you want to call it, is only useful from the point of view of how much power it's going to give you. So you could actually say, well, was Nietzsche part of the Nazi leader cult? Well, he might well have been, because quite a few of them read about him, quoted him, cited him, had his sister involved in meetings. But the cult also had other types, like Speer, who was into architecturalism, and Stryker, who was into master race, sexual misogyny, and all of that. So you can't actually just say, well, it was this, it was that. It's so complicated with the leader cult. It's very difficult to actually say they're one thing or another. When you actually break them down, they are a cocktail of weird identities. I've only picked on two for this, but if we'd have gone to a few others, I'm not sure that Goebbels was greatly into the occult, personally. Okay. Speer, probably not. Some of the more practical individuals in the cult, probably not. Was Ernst Röhm? I'm not so sure. Maybe.
Okay. Gary August is a question it couldn't all fit in one comment. Does Phil believe the belief system promotes a form of might makes right ideology where actions are judged not by conventional ethical standards, but by their target in achieving the goals of esoteric Nazism?
Yeah, pretty much. So that's a yes.
Okay, that was a nice, easy one. Yes. Okay, then.
Well, basically, if you're the master race and you destroy your opponent, whether it's in a church or whether it's on a battlefield or wherever, your might is your right, and you're right by your might. So yes, that's going to happen, but there's still complications in all of this, because even when they have done things in the way that they wanted to do it, they still have doubts about what they've done. If you know, you only have to imagine having marched into Russia in 1941. Why are so many of them having doubts about what they've done when only a month before they were really keen on what they've done?
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So we're winning, but why are we winning? And that's really odd. It doesn't come into many of the conversations, because when you're working on some of this stuff, you look at a doubt that Fegelein has in a text to, or stenography text to Baksalevsky or whoever, Kurt Deloiger, and there's a doubt in there because for one reason or another, maybe it's because their underpants were too tight, or one of the many other arguments they had. It's hard to know, but there is a doubt. Why are we doing this? And they constantly ask it of themselves and others.
Okay. Roderick asked a couple of times, you didn't mention Otto Hahn at any point.
Yeah, because he's in the Michael Wood talk, and I thought if I did it, it would be a bit of a spoiler, and it's very interesting how Hahn emerges.
Okay, thank you. So my last thing, I think, is about, you said yourself, we're not discussing this aspect of the Third Reich very much. We've kind of decided they're obviously the bad guys. We kind of boil it down. Someone made the "Are we the bad guys?" David Mitchell, Robert Webb joke in the sidebar there. Is some of the reason we're not examining this aspect, the Third Reich, is that we also, therefore, to be objective, have to look at some of the issues with the British Empire, with the manifest destiny of the USA. There are parallel, as we said earlier. The interest in the cult wasn't exclusively Germanic. It was widespread during the era we're talking about. So does that mean if we examine what's happening in the Third Reich, we kind of need to examine some of the weirder people on the Allied side, if that makes sense. I mean, there are Allied generals and leaders who had interesting beliefs, shall we say?
Well, Kitchener was involved in one of those strange societies before 1914 in Germany. There is evidence, loads of evidence. Alistair Crowley's English. Stuart Chamberlain is, I believe, English. So, you know, the overlaps and the country ups. What actually, by looking at occultism, and by, you know, I've not written anything on this. I've only looked what I've found when I've been doing the research and doing some secondary reading. Excuse me. But I don't think we've got enough evidence at this stage to make anything definite. All I can say is from what I've experienced in 25 years of looking at German records, these oddities come out and have never been fully explained. It's like that that ritual death picture I found, that lithograph. We haven't done enough work on those kind of things to know how common that was, or whether it was just a one-off. But the fact that it exists, and the fact that letters were written and a whole pile of correspondence took it to the highest echelons, tells you that there's some things going on that are very important.
Yeah. I mean, we're back in the discussion we've had many times before, is the convenience that we all have to some extent of keeping World War II within these parameters of which is the best tank, that's the cool aircraft, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. If you keep it in that very simplistic way, it's much easier for us all to digest it. We don't have to think too deeply about these things. And as you always do, you raise these questions that cause us all to start going, and we're not always comfortable with going that way where we should be.
Well, I think you know from when you came to Aachen that I actually have a great interest in German military history, the fighting vehicles, the tanks, the models. Everybody was talking to me over Christmas, or quite a few people were, about my wargaming with the models and what have you. And I know that I can tell the difference between a Mark IV and a Tiger tank and blah, blah, blah. But I think as an academic historian, as a professional historian, I have an onus to do something different in my work. And that takes me away from the things that, you know, technically you enjoy doing, into more problematical issues like this one with occultism. Now, I'm not going to, don't think I'm ever going to write a book on this subject, but it's very important to recognize that the occultism went from being an ideology that strange small groups and cliques lived off, fested off, whatever, suddenly got taken into a political regime and used for political ends.
You
know, the fact that the Thule Society, under any circumstance, Thule should have disappeared. But then Thule becomes caught up with all kinds of things, like the newspaper transfer with Ritter von Epp, and then the medal later in time. These things are critical, but also the Thule message, the master race, the search for Atlantis, they kept recurring within the Nazi period. And it's no good historians saying, well, okay, Hitler's a functionalist or an intentionalist or whatever back in the 60s, and today he's this, that, and the other, without really recognizing that these weird ideas were being taken on board by Hitler for the sole purpose of maximizing his power. And I think this idea of the cult and how cults work and operate, I mean, they have such huge power over their followers. And to actually have done this on a national level and to achieved it in a national level, I mean, Jonathan Meades says it's a bit like the whole of America suddenly becoming the Ku Klux Klan. I thought that was going a bit too far, but it's almost like, you know, in a more jokey way in Britain, everybody becoming a Morris dancer. You know, it would just seem odd.
Yeah.
You know? It would just seem odd.
I'm going to dream about that now. That's been Woody's nightmare, is going to be the UK all becoming Morris dancers and the bell manufacturers making billions.
You know what I mean? Something that's so small and outside and on the fringe suddenly becomes the national order of things. That is it's just a weird concept. And the more and more I've delved into this notion of the ritual, the sacrifice, the occultism, the paganism. I mean, I could have spent a long time going on the paganism within the SS, and the idea that every SS officer who wanted to get on became a God believer, so they would actually reduce their religious background. So if they were a Protestant Catholic, they'd wipe that out and say, right, I'm now a God believer, Gott glaube ich. The thing with that is, why would you do that for your career? Well, you do that for your career because you know you can't go any further unless you follow that pattern. And all of them, all of those German officers in the SS actually accepted that they became God believers or higher believers. Yeah, it's so bizarre, but it's an important factor in looking at the social dynamics of the culture of the SS. You know, it doesn't follow the pattern of Wittmann killing 138 tanks. It fills another compartment, which is why all of these guys behave the way they do, because they've all followed a similar pattern. And you go back to the chap who murdered all those French civilians in the French in Oradour-sur-Glane. He was a Gott glaube ich. He was a higher believer. Yeah, and he's no different from Dietrich.
Yeah, well,
I believe Dietrich was a decent chap anyway. But I mean, you know, you see what I'm saying?
I know what you mean.
They're all on the same. They're all on the same level, and they all behave in the same way, and they all have the same ambitions and agendas.
Well, we'll leave it there. I think Norma Graham is leaving with the idea there. That's a cautionary tale, isn't it? Cults and politics are a bad mixture. I think that's a very good, wise word. And just for Lost Beagle, who joined the chat, who believes I'm a bot and that we're not live, I'm not a bot. I'm responding in real time. I can do things. I can move about. I'm not. AI wouldn't create this or Phil there. AI is not that bad that it would create me and you, Phil, out of nothing. We are real, Lost Beagle.
I'm sat on my bot.
Yes, I'm sat on my bot too. So there we are. I mean, fantastic stuff. This is really, it's an interesting discussion. As always, you've given me lots to think about. Phil, I look forward to dealing with you again during 2025. Have a great year. If you haven't already, folks, go and get Dr. Phil's fantastic Aachen book. And as I said earlier, check him out on Substack. There's lots of great stuff there. But for the meantime, I'm saying goodbye. We're back again tomorrow. Kevin Himmler is on. We're talking about the 6888 movie and his involvement as historical consultant on that. So we'll be praising it and we'll be dishing it at the same time. But that's for tomorrow. So cheers, everybody. See you all again tomorrow. This is Paul from World War II TV. Happy New Year, everybody. Bye.